The laughter started before she even dropped her pack. 16 operators, combat veterans, men who had bled in places that don't appear on maps, and every single one of them was laughing at an 18-year-old girl standing alone at the gates of Black Ridge Tactical Station with dust on her boots and nothing to prove. Or so they thought. Their commander didn't bother with subtlety. He looked at her once, picked up her file, let it fall to the ground. Who the hell sent us a kid? More laughter. None of them knew they were mocking the only person who would save every one of their lives before the week was over. If this story already has you hooked, follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The desert doesn't care about your feelings. That was the first thing Lena Cross had ever learned about the Badlands of Western Arizona. Not from a teacher, not from a book, but from the land itself. From the way it baked and cracked and offered nothing. From the way a storm could appear on a clear horizon in under 40 minutes and strip the bark off mesquite trees before you'd finished deciding whether to run. The desert didn't apologize. It didn't explain itself. It simply was what it was, and if you couldn't meet it on its own terms, it would erase you without ceremony. She had grown up in a small, unincorporated settlement called Dry Hollow, which wasn't on most maps and didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. 40-odd structures arranged loosely around a single paved road, a fuel stop that doubled as a general store, and the kind of silence at night that pressed against your eardrums like something physical. Her father had been a former Army Ranger who came home with both legs, most of his hearing, and very little patience for noise. Her mother had left when Lena was 4, chasing something none of them talked about anymore. What remained was the two of them, 300 square miles of scrubland, and a discipline that was less a parenting philosophy than a survival methodology. By the time she was 10, Lena could field strip a rifle in under 2 minutes. By 12, she was running 6 miles in the pre-dawn dark because her father believed the best time to train was when everything inside you begged for sleep. By 15, she had stopped needing to be told what to do entirely. She simply watched, assessed, and acted, a habit the desert had burned into her the same way it burned everything, slowly, relentlessly, until it became the only thing left. None of that history was visible the morning she arrived at Black Ridge. What was visible was this, a girl who looked too young, too thin, and entirely too calm for the place she was standing. Black Ridge Tactical Station sat at the edge of a high desert plateau in a corner of the state that the highway signs forgot. It wasn't on civilian maps. It wasn't referenced in any public military directory. What it was, in the language of the people who actually knew it existed, was a Tier 1 pre-deployment evaluation facility. The kind of place where operators who already had deployments under their belts came to be broken down and reassembled before being cleared for the kind of operations that required a different category of human being entirely. It was not by any conventional logic a place for teenagers. The main gate was a reinforced steel barrier set between 2 concrete pillars with camera housings bolted to each one. A guard booth sat to the right. Behind the gate, a dirt road led half a mile toward a cluster of low buildings arranged in a squared-off compound shape, with a vehicle motor pool on the eastern edge, and what looked like a range complex extending further north into the flat, heat-shimmer terrain beyond. Lena had arrived by government transport vehicle, a nondescript gray panel van with federal plates that had dropped her at the gate checkpoint without ceremony and driven away before she'd finished shouldering her pack. She stood at the checkpoint window with her orders folder in one hand and her single military-issue duffel on the ground beside her boot, watching the guard review her paperwork with the slow, skeptical attention of a man who had already decided something didn't add up. "Date of birth," he said, not looking up. She told him. He looked up then, looked at her, looked back at the paper. "Says here you're cleared for echo-level evaluation integration." "That's correct." He made a sound that wasn't quite a word and reached for his radio. She waited. The gate opened 5 minutes later. The walk from the gate to the main assembly area was long enough to be observed. She understood that immediately. The distance existed, at least in part, so that whoever was already inside had time to form a first impression before the new arrival could complicate it with anything as inconvenient as an actual conversation. By the time she reached the hard-packed dirt square in front of the operations building, she had already been assessed by at least a dozen sets of eyes. They stood in loose clusters near the building's entrance, some with coffee, some without, most in the kind of relaxed, aggressive posture that operators defaulted to when they were trying to look like they weren't paying attention to something they were absolutely paying attention to. They ranged in age from mid-20s to early 40s, and they shared a certain quality that was hard to describe precisely, but impossible to mistake. The quality of men who had been in situations where the wrong call killed people, and who had survived enough of those situations to develop opinions about the kind of person you wanted next to you when it happened again. The laughter, when it came, was almost immediate. Not explosive, not the kind of laughter that filled a room. It was the murmured sidelong kind, the elbow nudge kind, the kind that passed between men who shared a joke they didn't need to say out loud because the punchline was standing right in front of them. Lena set her duffel on the ground and waited. A man separated from the group near the entrance and walked toward her with the unhurried authority of someone who owned the space he moved through. He was somewhere in his late 40s, wide-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that looked like it had been left outside in weather for 20 years and hadn't minded. He wore no rank insignia. This facility operated outside standard uniform protocols, but his bearing made his position unmistakable. This was Commander Cole Mercer. She'd read his publicly available record, which was sparse, and the parts of his unofficial record that her father had quietly passed along, which were considerably less so. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, looked her over the way a mechanic looked at an engine he expected to be seized. Then he reached out, took her orders folder from her hand without asking, opened it, skimmed the first page and let it fall. Not handed back, not set down, let fall. The folder hit the dirt. Paper shifted in the dry wind. "Who sent us a kid?" he said. Behind him, the laughter came back stronger this time. Lena didn't move to pick up the folder. She looked at him with the same expression she wore when she was waiting for the desert wind to shift before she took a shot. Neutral, focused, unhurried. "Orders were cut by regional command," she said. "Routing numbers on page 2 if you need to verify." Mercer's jaw moved slightly. "I know where the routing number is." "Then you know I'm supposed to be here." A beat of silence. Somewhere behind him, someone made a low sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, or might have been something else entirely. Mercer bent, picked up the folder, and tucked it under his arm without looking at it again. "Room assignments on the board inside. Rack check at 0530. Don't be late." He turned and walked back toward the building. Over his shoulder, without breaking stride, "And somebody tell the kitchen we've got a new mouth." More laughter. She picked up her duffel, settled it on her shoulder, and walked toward the entrance. The room assigned to her was at the far end of the barracks corridor, the last door before the fire exit, which was also the coldest section of the building when desert temperatures dropped after dark, which they did, dramatically, every single night. It was not an accident. She understood that without needing to be told. The other evaluation candidates were assigned rooms near the central heating units. She was assigned the room that made a statement. She unpacked with the efficient economy of someone who had done it in worse conditions. 2 sets of training clothes, 1 pair of running shoes, 1 pair of boots, already broken in, a field notebook, not digital, not encrypted, just a worn olive drab notebook with a pen clipped to the cover, a photograph tucked inside the front cover, her father standing in the yard at Dry Hollow with his arms crossed, and an expression that was as close to a smile as his face ever managed. That was all. She made the rack tight enough to bounce a quarter, set her boots precisely at the end of it, and spent 40 minutes reviewing what she could observe through the room's single high window. The angle of the motor pool lights, the patrol pattern of the 2 visible security personnel, the direction and velocity of the wind as it moved dust across the compound. At 23:40, someone knocked on her door once and then opened it without waiting for an answer. The man who leaned against the frame was shorter than most of the others she'd seen, with a shaved head and a nose that had been broken at least twice. He had the kind of eyes that were perpetually evaluating something. "Sergeant Dax Rourke," he said. "Nobody sent me. I just wanted to see what you look like up close." "Now you know." "You're actually 18? September 14th. He made a small sound. "Huh." He looked around the room, noted the absence of anything unnecessary, noted the placement of her boots. "Mercer's going to bury you tomorrow. You know that?" "I expect so." "And that doesn't bother you?" It wasn't really a question. She treated it like one anyway. It would bother me if he didn't. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then, not unkindly, get some sleep. He left without closing the door. She closed it herself, lay down on the rack, and was asleep in under 4 minutes. At 0400, before the 0530 rack check, Lena was already dressed and standing in the compound. The temperature had dropped to 41 degrees. The stars overhead were the dense, unbothered kind you only saw far from city light. A solid ceiling of them, so thick in places they blurred together. She stood with her hands at her sides and breathed the cold air and looked north toward the range complex, where yellow security lights cast long shadows across the empty firing lanes. She was thinking about Mercer, not about how to impress him, about how he thought. In the 3 hours since she'd arrived, she'd already formed a working theory. He was excellent, the record was real, not manufactured, but he was also a man who trusted a specific hierarchy of evidence, and that hierarchy was anchored to experience, to seniority, to the kind of credibility you accumulated over years in the field. That wasn't a flaw. It was a reasonable adaptation to a world where untested variables got people killed. The problem was that it left a blind spot, a significant one. He couldn't evaluate what he refused to observe, and he had already decided not to observe her. Behind her, the barracks door opened and boots hit dirt. The other candidates were emerging for the early formation, most of them looking like men who had slept well and were comfortable in the routine. A few noticed her standing there. Nobody said anything directly to her. She heard one comment, half muffled, that involved the word daycare. She didn't turn around. At exactly 5:30, Mercer appeared at the head of the formation area with a clipboard and a look that suggested he'd been awake since before she had. Formation, now. 16 candidates arranged themselves in 2 lines. Lena took her position at the right end of the second row. Mercer walked the line slowly, making notes, and paused in front of her. Cross. He said it the way you might say the name of a piece of equipment that had arrived in the wrong shipment. Your evaluation packet includes a performance tier designation I don't recognize. Echo level integration. I know what it says. I'm telling you I don't recognize it, which means I have no basis for calibrating your evaluation against standard benchmarks. He looked at her over the top of the clipboard. So I'm going to treat you the same as everyone else here. That means full load, full standard, no accommodation. I didn't ask for accommodation. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like a recalibration. He moved on without responding. The first day began, but this bit in buckets. The morning's primary evaluation was a 3-mile terrain run with a weighted pack. 68 pounds, standard load, across the rocky desert track that wound north from the compound and back in a wide loop. The track was not flat. It climbed 2 significant ridgelines, dropped through a rocky drainage channel that was murder on ankles, and finished with a half-mile uphill grade back toward the compound. The temperature by the time they assembled at the start line was already climbing toward 80 degrees, and the sun was aggressive in the way desert sun always was. Not just warm, but pressing, like something that wanted inside your skin. Lena's pack had been adjusted. She didn't know this yet, but she had suspected it was possible, which was why she'd checked the seal on the side compression straps before they left the equipment bay. The straps had been retightened since she'd last touched them. She hadn't touched them since she'd loaded the pack herself. She did a quick visual check during the pre-run briefing and estimated an additional 12 to 15 pounds had been added, probably via a weighted insert slipped into the bottom compartment while she wasn't watching. She didn't report it. She didn't adjust the straps. She just did the math in her head and revised her pacing model. Approximately 80-plus pounds. 3 miles. Moderate to difficult terrain. 90-degree ambient temperature by midpoint. She was going to have to be precise. Sergeant Rourke was standing next to her at the start line when the signal sounded, and he glanced sideways at her once as they began moving. His eyes went briefly to her pack, noting she suspected that it rode lower than it should have. He said nothing. She didn't sprint off the line the way 2 of the others did. That was a mistake she'd watched men make at the facility's morning run tracks back home, burning glycogen reserves in the first half-mile because the ego wanted to establish position, then suffering for it across the second half of the course. She found her pace before the first quarter-mile marker, a hard, steady, sustainable rhythm that felt like work but not like emergency. Her breathing locked into a pattern. Her footfalls shortened and quickened on the uphill grades, lengthened and softened on the descents. Every technical habit her father had drilled into her for 6 years of pre-dawn runs through terrain, just as difficult as this one, clicked into place like a mechanism. The first ridgeline climbed steeply through loose shale. 3 of the candidates lost their footing at various points. She picked her line differently than they did, closer to the inner edge of the track where the surface was more compressed, and moved through it without breaking stride. By the halfway mark, 4 of the 16 had fallen behind the main cluster. She was not among them. By the 2-mile mark, 2 more had dropped back. One of them, a man in his 30s with impressive upper body mass that was suddenly working against him in the heat, slowing to a walk and bracing his hands on his knees as she passed him. She didn't look at him as she went by. It wasn't contempt. Looking would have cost her oxygen and focus, and neither could be spared. She crossed the finish line 4th, behind the 2 sprinters who had burned themselves out early and somehow still finished in the top 3 on nerve alone, and ahead of 11 battle-tested operators who had been doing this kind of work since she was in middle school. Commander Mercer was standing at the finish line with his clipboard and a water table and an expression that hadn't changed since that morning. He watched her cross, wrote something, said nothing. Work finished behind her by about 40 seconds, which Lena suspected was not his actual capability, but she couldn't be certain. He stopped beside her at the water table and accepted a bottle without reaching for it, just picked it up and looked at her. "Heavy," he said. She didn't answer. "Your pack." "I know." He didn't ask anything else. The afternoon was the tactical navigation exercise, a solo land nav course through a 6-kilometer section of the desert north of the compound, using a paper map and a compass and no GPS. The course had 12 checkpoints embedded in the terrain. Candidates had to locate each one, note the alphanumeric code posted at the marker, and return to the finish point within a target time window. Points were awarded based on checkpoints found and time. The record at this facility, which Rourke had mentioned casually at lunch as though it was general knowledge, was 11 checkpoints in 43 minutes. The temperature at start time was 109 degrees. Lena spent 4 minutes with her map before the start signal. Not sketching routes, she'd been trained not to rely on a single planned route. She was reading terrain. The map showed topography and 20-foot contour intervals, and she was translating those squiggly lines into a 3-dimensional picture of what the ground would actually look like out there. Where the high ground was, where the drainages ran, where the vegetation density would slow movement, where the sun angle would make visual navigation hardest. She found all 12 checkpoints. She finished in 41 minutes. When she handed her checkpoint sheet to the evaluator at the finish line, he checked it twice and then picked up his radio without saying anything to her, which told her more than any verbal response would have. She sat down on a flat rock at the edge of the course, drank water, and watched the sun move across the sky. That night, the communal meal in the facility's mess hall carried the atmosphere of a room where the prevailing assumption had been partially disturbed without being entirely overturned. Men were processing. The laughter from the morning had quieted into something more watchful. A few of them had started making direct eye contact with her, which was a form of acknowledgement that hadn't been present at lunch. Not respect. Not yet. Just a revised uncertainty. She sat at the end of a table with her tray and ate without joining the main conversation clusters. This was by choice. She was still building her picture of the unit, and observing was more useful than performing. She noted who talked loudest, who listened more than they spoke, who deferred to Mercer in his presence, and who had separate conversations when his back was turned. She noted Rourke, who sat at the center table but faced sideways, a habit she recognized as the instinct of someone trained never to sit with their back fully to a room. She noted a man across the hall who had watched her throughout the afternoon's exercise with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not hostile exactly, more like someone who hadn't decided yet. His name tape read Vasco. He was one of the ones who hadn't laughed at her arrival. After dinner, Mercer posted the day's standings on the common board without ceremony. She was 3rd overall across both evaluations. Below the 2 names above her, both veterans with multiple deployments, both exceptional by any standard, but above 13 others who had been doing this work before she'd started high school. She read the board once, and went back to her room. At 2200, someone slid a folded piece of paper under her door. She unfolded it. Handwritten, block letters. "They're adding weight to your pack again tomorrow. Good luck." No signature. She looked at the handwriting for a moment, considering it. Then she folded the paper, tucked it into her field notebook, and turned off her lamp. In the dark, she lay on her rack and reviewed the day's events with the same quiet precision she applied to everything. Her body registered the fatigue honestly. The weighted pack run had cost her more than a standard effort would have, and the afternoon heat had added to that deficit. She wasn't invulnerable. She wasn't some kind of machine immune to accumulating damage. She was just very, very good at doing what was necessary, despite it. The second morning brought the weapon qualification block. This was supposed to be a 2-day progression. Day 2 covered pistol and carbine at standard ranges, nothing that would challenge anyone with real trigger time. Day 3 was the precision rifle evaluation, which was where reputations actually got made or revised. It was the event that operators at this facility talked about the way combat aviators talked about their first carrier landing, the moment when the stakes were real enough to strip away everything except what you actually were. The pistol and carbine work in the morning went unremarkably. She was fast, accurate, and had no visible mechanical problems with either platform. The men around her were largely the same, good shooters with good fundamentals and the accumulated confidence of people who had spent years trusting their weapons. Nobody made comments during the shooting blocks, which was its own form of acknowledgement. At the range, results were visible and immediate, and left no room for the kind of interpretation that social dynamics ran on. What happened at lunch was something different. Mercer had called a brief tactical review session in the mission room, a standard dry erase and folding chairs affair where the morning's evaluation data was discussed and the afternoon's schedule outlined. She found a seat toward the middle of the room, which was not where Mercer had implied she should sit. He gestured, without quite pointing, toward the back row. She sat in the middle anyway. He didn't address it directly. Instead, he opened the tactical review with a scenario question. A 4-man element moving through a contested urban structure encountered an unexpected structural collapse blocking their primary exfil route. What were the immediate action priorities? He went around the room asking for input. The answers were competent, standard immediate action protocols, secondary exfil considerations, casualty management implications. When he reached her, he paused for approximately 2 seconds longer than he had with anyone else. The pause said, "I'm doing this because I have to, not because I expect anything. Assess the structural integrity of the alternate routes before committing anyone," she said. Secondary collapse is more likely in the first 4 minutes than after stabilization. Your element moves, you establish comms with the QRF, and transmit your revised exfil grid, not the original. Because if the primary collapsed, whatever intelligence assessment produced that primary route is now questionable, and the QRF needs to know you're operating off revised geometry. She paused. Also check your casualties before you move anyone. A secondary collapse didn't just change your route. It might have changed your head count. The room was quiet. Mercer wrote something on the dry erase board that wasn't her answer, which was a choice. Anyone else? But she watched Vasco, across the room, write something in his own notebook. The afternoon's carbine block finished just before 1700. Afterward, while other candidates cleaned weapons in the bay, Sergeant Rourke found her at the water point near the range's northern edge. "The precision rifle evaluation is tomorrow morning," he said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the range complex. The late afternoon sun turned the desert floor a deep amber color and made the rocky ridgeline to the north look like something painted. "You shoot long glass?" he asked. The phrase was casual, insider language. Precision optics on a bolt rifle, extended distances. "Some." "How far?" She looked at him. "Far enough." Rourke made a small sound that might have been almost a laugh. He started walking back toward the compound, then stopped and turned slightly. "Mercer's going to put you on the farthest board," he said. "Not because the eval requires it, because he wants to watch you fail in front of everyone." She nodded. "And?" "And I wanted you to know going in," he said, "in case it changed anything for you." "It doesn't." He nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected. "Yeah," he said. "I didn't think it would." He walked back toward the compound. She stood at the water point for a moment longer, watching the light change on the ridgeline. Somewhere out past the northern perimeter, a coyote called once and went quiet. Tomorrow, everything was going to change. She just needed to let it. That night, she cleaned the precision rifle she'd been issued that afternoon, a bolt-action chassis system in .308 with a variable optic and a suppressor mount, with the specific ritualistic attention of someone who understood that the relationship between a shooter and a weapon wasn't mechanical. It was communicative. You learned a rifle the way you learned a person, through handling, through attention, through the accumulation of small observations that told you how it behaved under specific conditions. This rifle had a trigger with a slightly heavier pull than she preferred, somewhere around 4 pounds, where she liked 3. The barrel had been recently cleaned but showed microscopic carbon fouling at the crown that suggested the last user had been a slightly inconsistent cleaner. These were small things. She filed them. She was still at the cleaning table at 2300 when Vasco appeared in the doorway of the equipment bay. He was the only one of the 16 who hadn't laughed on the first morning. She hadn't forgotten that. He leaned against the frame and watched her work for a moment without speaking. "What you said in the tactical review," he said finally, "about the secondary collapse window. What about it?" "It was right. I looked it up. There's a structural failure study out of Kabul, 2009. First 4 minutes, the secondary probability is almost 70%. "I know." Mercer knows too. She ran the bore brush through the chamber one more time. "I know that as well." Vasco was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to make his life complicated." She looked up at him, not with challenge, just a steady, matter-of-fact gaze. "I'm not here to make his life anything. I'm here to do the work." He thought about that, nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He pushed off the doorframe. "Get some sleep." "You too." After he was gone, she finished the cleaning, replaced the bolt, verified the 0 marks on the scope turret, and set the rifle in its case. She sat for a moment in the silence of the equipment bay, under the single fluorescent light that buzzed at a frequency just barely outside the range of annoyance. Somewhere across the compound, she could hear voices. Men talking, the way men talked late at night in a facility like this, about things that mattered and things that didn't in roughly equal measure. She heard her name once, spoken by a voice she didn't recognize, and then a quieter response she couldn't make out. She wasn't afraid of tomorrow. That wasn't bravado. It wasn't performance. It was something more basic than either. The settled understanding that fear was a tool like any other, and like any tool, it was only useful when applied correctly. Fear at the wrong moment cost you the fraction of a second that separated a hit from a miss. Fear at the right moment kept you from stepping onto ground that would give way. She knew the difference. Her father had made sure of that. She closed the case, clicked the latches, and walked back through the dark compound to her room at the far end of the barracks. The desert night was enormous and cold and full of stars. Tomorrow, before the sun reached the ridgeline, she was going to stand at the farthest firing position on this range, with a rifle she'd known for less than a day, while 16 experienced operators watched and expected her to fail. And they were going to discover something they hadn't been prepared for. Not because she was trying to prove a point, but because sometimes the truth about a person couldn't be hidden forever, no matter how carefully everyone around them had decided not to look. She was almost asleep when the sound reached her, a low, irregular pulse of radio traffic drifting from the operations building, 200 meters across the compound. Not unusual in itself. Communications traffic ran through this facility at odd hours routinely, given the operational tempo of the units that cycled through here. But this frequency was wrong. Not the internal training net, not the administrative channel, something else. Something that didn't match any of the frequencies she'd been briefed on during her intake, which she had memorized the way she memorized everything, thoroughly and without effort. She lay still and listened. The transmission lasted perhaps 8 seconds and then went quiet. She stayed awake for another 20 minutes, parsing what she'd heard against what she knew. She didn't arrive at a conclusion, not yet, but she filed it, the way she filed everything, in the part of her mind that knew the difference between details that were merely unusual and details that were wrong. This one, she suspected, was wrong. And wrong details, in her experience, had a way of becoming very important at exactly the worst possible moment. The transmission stayed with her through the night like a splinter she couldn't locate. Not painful enough to demand immediate action, but present enough that her sleeping mind kept circling back to it, testing it, turning it over. She was up at 4:15, not because an alarm told her to be, because her body had been calibrated to this hour for years, and because she had learned long ago that the quiet before a facility woke up was the most honest version of it. Before the performance of the day began, before everyone arranged themselves into the roles they'd decided to play, the place existed on its own terms. She could read it more clearly then. She dressed in the dark, laced her boots by feel, and sat on the edge of her rack for 2 minutes with her field notebook open to a blank page. She wrote down the transmission window. The approximate frequency range. She didn't have equipment to pin it precisely, but years of listening to her father work his field radios had given her a working mental library of how different bands sounded over distance. This one had the characteristic flutter of UHF traffic bouncing off terrain, which meant the source was likely elevated, possibly the northern ridgeline she'd been watching since she arrived. She wrote down the time. She wrote down the duration. Then she closed the notebook, tucked it under her mattress, and went outside into the cold. The precision rifle range occupied the northernmost section of the evaluation complex, separated from the carbine and pistol lanes by a low earthwork berm that ran east to west. The range itself was long, significantly longer than the standard qualification distances most facilities used. The firing line was a covered concrete pad with individual shooting positions separated by low dividers. Downrange steel targets were fixed at varying intervals, the farthest of which sat at a distance that made it look, from the firing line, like a suggestion rather than a target. Mercer had the candidates assembled at the firing line at 700. The sun was already working. Not brutal yet, that would come later, but committed, the way desert sun always was by mid-morning, heating the air in uneven layers that would, within the next 2 hours, start producing the shimmer effect that made long-range shooting into an exercise in reading atmosphere as much as technique. Mercer ran through the evaluation parameters without preamble. Each candidate would shoot a 5-round string at each distance, beginning at 300 meters and progressing outward. Scores were cumulative. The evaluation extended to a maximum distance of 1,000 meters, which was the farthest target on the facility's range. Nobody was required to shoot the farthest target. The evaluation ended when a candidate's score dropped below a threshold standard, or when they reached the maximum distance, whichever came first. In practice, Mercer told them, nobody at this facility had ever engaged the 1,000-meter target in evaluation conditions and posted a qualifying score. He didn't look at her when he said it. She noticed. The early distances went the way she expected. 300 meters, 400, 500. These were ranges that most of the operators handled efficiently, some of them brilliantly. There were real shooters in this group. A man named Calloway, one of the sprinters from the first morning's run, turned out to shoot with a focused, unhurried precision that was completely at odds with his general energy, and his scores through the mid-range distances were exceptional. Work was technically clean. Economical movement, consistent trigger pull, no wasted time. But he wasn't hunting a record. He was simply hitting what he needed to hit. She shot fourth in the rotation. 300 meters, 5 for 5. The trigger brake was exactly where she'd mapped it during last night's dry fire work. Slightly heavier than she'd have chosen, but predictable, which was what mattered. She adjusted her natural point of aim between each shot rather than relying on the same mechanical position, because she'd learned that subtle body tension accumulated with each round and through the next one if you didn't account for it. 400, 5 for 5. 500, 5 for 5. She spent more time between shots than the other candidates did. Not hesitation, reading. The wind across this particular stretch of desert had a behavior she was still mapping. It came primarily from the northwest in steady gusts, but every few minutes it shifted east by approximately 15 degrees before returning. If you fired during the shift and used data calibrated for the primary direction, your round went left. The shift lasted about 8 seconds. She waited for it to pass before each shot. A few of the other candidates noticed the waiting. She heard someone near the back of the covered line make a comment about it. Something about taking all day. She fired her 5th round at 500 and didn't look toward the comment. At 600 meters, 2 candidates fell below threshold and stepped out of the rotation. At 700, 3 more. By 800 meters, the field had narrowed to 6. Calloway, Rourke, 2 others whose names she'd learned were Priest and Marbury. One man she still thought of only by his physical descriptor, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, deliberate, whose name tape read Decker and Lena. Mercer stood behind the firing line with his clipboard, and she was aware of him the way she was aware of the wind, not focused on him but constantly factored in. 800 meters. The target was barely visible at this distance, heat shimmers starting to blur its edges. She settled behind the rifle, worked through her breathing sequence, and fired 5 rounds at a pace that was slower than anyone else's in the rotation. 4 impacts. 1 miss on the 3rd round. She'd misjudged the wind shift by half a second. She noted it. Didn't try to explain it or dismiss it. Filed it. The shift interval was shortening as the temperature climbed. Calloway shot 800 clean. Rourke went 4 for 5. Priest 3 for 5. At 900 meters, the situation changed. Calloway missed twice. Rourke dropped to 3 hits. Priest and Marbury both stepped out of the rotation. Decker went 4 for 5 and held on. Lena went 5 for 5. The range was very quiet. She heard it. Not applause, not comments, just a specific quality of silence that had a different texture than the silence before. The before silence had been expectant, leaning toward dismissal. This silence was recalibrating. It was the sound of people updating a model they'd built on incomplete data. Mercer's pen moved on his clipboard. He looked up. 1,000 meters. Decker stepped up to the line. He was a good shooter. His mechanics were sound and his concentration was visible and real. He fired 5 rounds with the careful patience of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. 2 hits, 3 misses. His jaw tightened as the spotting calls came back from downrange. He stepped back without a word. Then Lena. She moved to the firing position and settled behind the rifle. The 1,000-meter target, at this distance and in these conditions, was not simply far. It was genuinely difficult in a way that compounded every variable: trigger mechanics, atmospheric reading, position stability, round-to-round consistency. The heat shimmer was significant now. The target floated and distorted in the rising thermal air, appearing to shift left, then right, in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the actual wind. You had to learn to look through it rather than at it. Most shooters, even good ones, instinctively tracked the shimmer. She'd taught herself years ago, on the long ridgelines above Dry Hollow, to focus on the point where the shimmer's median lay, the imaginary still center of the movement, and fire through that. She also knew she'd burned a significant amount of physical reserve over the past 2 days. Her right shoulder, where the pack had distributed its extra load, carried a deep ache that she'd been managing through postural discipline. It wasn't debilitating, but it meant her position stability was a few percentage points below her best day standard, and at 1,000 meters, a few percentage points mattered. She took 4 seconds longer than usual to settle. First round, hit. The steel rang, a clean, sharp tone that carried back to the firing line with a delay of almost 3 seconds at this distance. She heard someone behind her exhale. Second round, hit. Third round. She felt the wind shift beginning at the top of her breath cycle. She waited. 7 seconds. The shift passed. She fired. Hit. Fourth round. A gust. Not the rhythmic shift, but a lateral interruption, the kind of unpredictable event that no reading could fully anticipate. She felt it across the back of her left hand. She adjusted her windage estimate by a half minute, held, breathed. Hit. The last round. She was aware of the silence behind her in a way she generally wasn't. It had become a kind of pressure, not hostile but dense, the weight of multiple people's attention focusing on the same small point. She registered it and then set it aside, the way she set aside the shoulder ache and the heat and the accumulated fatigue of 2 days under deliberate pressure. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. The delay stretched. The steel rang. She stayed behind the optic for 1 extra second, then lifted her head and rolled back from the position without drama. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Calloway, from somewhere behind and to her left, 5 for 5. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement you make when you've just watched something that reordered your understanding of the situation. Mercer wrote on his clipboard. His face gave nothing. Evaluation concluded. Back to the compound for debrief at 1100. She collected her brass. The debrief was held in the same mission room as the previous day's tactical review, and the atmosphere was different in a way that was hard to point to precisely, but easy to feel. The seating arrangement had shifted slightly, fewer tight clusters, more distributed positioning, like a room that had partially rearranged its social geometry overnight. She took the same middle row seat as yesterday. Mercer presented the evaluation results on the dry erase board without editorial comment, which was itself a form of editorial comment. Rankings, scores, performance metrics across all evaluated categories. Her name appeared in the top 3 positions across multiple categories without appearing at the absolute top of any single one, which was a pattern she found interesting and which she suspected was either coincidental or, more likely, the result of Mercer having some discretion in how individual metrics were weighted. She didn't challenge it. What she was watching instead was how the room read the board. Most of the men read it the way people always read public performance data, first looking for their own name, then scanning upward to identify who was above them and why, then lateral to confirm their position relative to peers. Calloway read it and nodded once, which told her he'd already known roughly where he stood. Rourke didn't appear to read it at all, which told her he either already had the data or had decided he didn't need it. Decker read it for a long time, then looked at her. Not with hostility, with the specific look of a man doing arithmetic. After the debrief, Mercer announced the afternoon's program, Close Quarters Battle Familiarization in the Shoot House, which was a 4-room structure set up behind the main range complex for exactly this kind of scenario work. Movement through structure, target discrimination, shoot/no-shoot decision-making, 2-man pair drills. He paired her with Decker. She wasn't certain whether this was punishment for one of them or a test for both. The shoot house smelled like burnt powder and old hydraulic fluid and the specific chalk dust smell of concrete walls that had absorbed years of marking rounds. It was windowless except for the camera housings mounted high in each corner, and the target system was a mix of static cardboard, pivot-mounted steel, and one hydraulic pop-up that appeared on a timer at random intervals. Decker was the kind of shooter who led with his upper body. Not a technical flaw exactly, but a tendency that meant his first instinct when entering a doorway was to push his weapon and his sightline through before he'd fully committed his footwork, which created a fractional moment of mechanical imbalance. She identified this in the first dry walkthrough before they ran the course live. She didn't point it out. That wasn't her role here. What she did instead was position her own entry angles to cover the moments when his tendency created a gap, so that if the gap was exploited by a target appearing in an unexpected position, she was already in the right place to handle it. On the first live run, it worked. On the second, almost, she caught a partial target in the left doorway of the third room that Decker's positioning had left uncovered, and she engaged it clean, but the angle required her to roll her footing in a way that was technically awkward, and she knew if that had been a real situation, the awkwardness would have cost her something. After the second run, Decker said, "You covered my left in that third room." "Yes." "I didn't ask you to." "No." He processed this for a moment. "Why?" She looked at him. "Because the target was there." He was quiet for a few seconds. Then, "You saw the gap before we ran it." "Yes." "And you didn't say anything. Would it have helped?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Probably not," he admitted, and there was something honest in that admission that she hadn't expected from him, a willingness to acknowledge a thing about himself that most men in this environment spent considerable energy not acknowledging. "Show me what you saw." So she did. Not lecturing, just walking the entry angle with him, demonstrating the physical geometry of the issue, and watching him absorb it with the focused attention of a man who learned fast when he decided to. They ran the course 4 more times. By the final run, the gap was gone. When they came out of the shoot house the last time, Mercer was standing outside with his clipboard, and she knew from the set of his shoulders that he'd been watching the camera feeds from inside. He looked at Decker, then at her, wrote something, said nothing, and walked away. Decker watched him go. Then, to Lena, without quite looking at her, "You're going to be a problem for him." "I'm not trying to be." "Doesn't matter what you're trying," Decker said. He adjusted his rifle's sling and started walking toward the equipment bay. What matters is what you are. Done. That evening, Rourke found her at the water point on the range's northern edge for the second time. This had become, apparently, their de facto meeting location. Not by arrangement, but by the logic of the facility's geography and Rourke's evident preference for conversations that didn't have witnesses. "You heard about tomorrow," he said. "Physical stress evaluation. Oh, 500 start. Full protocol." He looked at the ridgeline. "Mercer's running it himself." The full physical stress protocol at this facility, which she'd read about in the intake documents, was a continuous 24-hour evaluation cycle that combined physical performance metrics with decision-making assessments conducted under progressive sleep and caloric deprivation. It was designed to measure how candidates performed when the body's resources were genuinely compromised, on the theory that the kind of operations these candidates were being evaluated for would sometimes require exactly that. The key variable was that the evaluators controlled the conditions, which meant Mercer controlled the conditions. "What's he planning to run with the load?" Rourke was quiet for a moment. "I heard 85 minimum." That was a significant number. 85 pounds over a 24-hour cycle that included repeated physical events would produce real cumulative damage, not dangerous, in a healthy young body with appropriate monitoring, but genuinely uncomfortable in a way that went beyond discomfort into the territory of genuine physical consequence. "For everyone?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, which answered for him. She nodded. "Just me." "I can't confirm that." "You don't have to." He turned slightly to face her. "I'm not going to tell you to quit. That's not why I'm here." He paused. "But I want you to understand, he's not going to stop. Not from embarrassment, not from pressure. Men like Mercer, when they've decided something, they escalate. They don't retreat." "I know. You've been through something like this before." It wasn't a question. He'd arrived at it the same way she would have, from observation, from the way she responded to pressure, from the specific quality of her composure, which wasn't the composure of someone who had never been tested. It was the composure of someone who had been tested past the point of comfort and had discovered something on the other side. "Different context," she said, "but you know what it costs." Yes. Rourke was quiet for a moment. The desert around them was cooling into its nighttime version, the wind off the high plateau dropping to a low, persistent push that moved dry grass in long waves. Somewhere to the north, the ridgeline sat dark against a sky that was beginning to show the first faint suggestion of stars. "Why'd you come here, Vi?" he asked. The question was genuine, not a challenge, actual curiosity. She considered how to answer it. The honest answer was complicated by the fact that it had several layers, and she hadn't decided how many layers this man had earned access to. "Because it's the next thing," she said finally. "Next thing toward what?" "I don't know yet." He accepted this. Most people wouldn't have. "Fair enough," he said, which was the same thing Vasco had said in the equipment bay, and she noticed the symmetry of it. These two men, different in almost every visible way, arriving at the same three-word response to the same fundamental characteristic in her. She filed that as well. "Get some sleep while you can," Rourke said. "Tomorrow's going to be long." He walked back toward the compound. She stayed at the water point for another few minutes, listening to the desert. Then she heard it again, the radio transmission. Same frequency range, same flutter of elevated UHF. But this time it was longer. Not 8 seconds, but closer to 20. And during those 20 seconds, she caught something she hadn't caught the previous night. A partial alphanumeric sequence embedded in what would have sounded to an untrained ear like signal noise or atmospheric artifact. The kind of embedded transmission protocol that predated modern encryption precisely because it was boring, because it sounded like nothing. She closed her eyes and focused. 6 characters, possibly 7. She wasn't certain of the last. She walked back to her room at a normal pace, sat on her rack, opened her field notebook, and wrote down what she'd heard. She looked at it for a long time. A partial alphanumeric string embedded in what appeared to be ambient frequency noise, transmitted from an elevated position to the north of the facility over 2 consecutive nights at approximately the same time window. Individually, each element of that was explainable as something routine or coincidental. Together, they described something else. She kept the notebook open on her knee and stared at the page for a long time, thinking about a father who had spent years teaching her that the most dangerous threats were the ones that arrived disguised as ordinary noise. The physical stress evaluation began at 04:55, in the cold dark, with a formation that nobody had been given specific notification of until Mercer's voice came over the facility's PA system at 04:30 with a 15-minute assembly call that allowed just enough time to dress and move. Sleep interruption as a deliberate tool. She'd expected it. She arrived at the formation area at 04:50 with her pack already shouldered. She'd loaded it the night before, including the base kit specified in the evaluation protocol, and left it ready at the end of her rack. She was the first candidate at the assembly point by 4 minutes, which meant she was standing in the cold when the others emerged, and she was the only one whose pack was already on. Mercer noticed this. She saw it in the brief pause when he walked the forming line. He moved on, without comment. The pack weight verification happened next. Each candidate's load was checked against the specified protocol weight. When the evaluator reached her station, he ran the scale twice, then a third time. He showed the number to Mercer without speaking. Mercer looked at it, then at her. 92 pounds. She waited. Protocol minimum is 68. I know. You're carrying 92. Yes. His jaw moved. Why? She looked straight ahead at the middle distance, which was the desert morning, which was dark and cold and enormous. Extra water, supplementary medical kit, signaling equipment. None of which is on the required load list. No, but some of which might be useful. The silence had a particular texture. She could feel the attention of the men around her, not all of it visible, but present in the way that attention always was, a slight shift in the collective posture of people who were listening without appearing to listen. Take the extra weight out, Mercer said. The protocol says candidates may carry additional equipment at their discretion, provided total weight doesn't exceed 120. He stared at her. The stare lasted long enough that it crossed from evaluative into something else, something that was working hard to stay controlled. Fine, he said, and moved on down the line. She let out the breath she'd been holding inside her ribs since she'd stepped on the scale. It wasn't bravado. Every item she'd added had a specific strategic logic, more water because she knew from the past 2 days that this environment dehydrated faster than most candidates would account for. And dehydration started affecting decision-making well before it affected physical performance. And the evaluation was going to measure both. The medical kit, because 24 hours of continuous physical stress produced real injuries, and candidates who had to stop for treatment fell behind, whereas candidates who could self-manage minor injuries in motion didn't. The signaling equipment, because of the radio transmission she'd heard 2 nights running from the northern ridgeline. She wasn't carrying 92 pounds because she wanted to suffer. She was carrying it because she'd already decided what kind of night this might become. The evaluation moved through the desert in stages, not a continuous march, but a sequence of discrete physical and cognitive events separated by controlled rest windows that were short enough to prevent real recovery and long enough to give the illusion of it. The structure was familiar from what she'd read in the intake documents, timed movement legs alternating with marksmanship checks, navigation problems, and scenario-based decision exercises that arrived without warning and had to be completed under accumulated fatigue. By hour 6, the field had compressed. 3 candidates had developed ankle or knee issues that were being managed in motion by the facility's medical observers, officially still in the evaluation, but clearly slowing. 2 others had requested medical assessment and been taken off the course. The remaining 11 moved through the morning in a loose column, spread along a desert track that wound through increasingly broken terrain as it pushed north toward the plateau's edge. At the 8-hour mark, the navigation problem dropped. A grid reference and a single instruction: identify the anomaly. No other context. The grid reference pointed to a rocky outcropping approximately 300 meters east of the current track, a feature that, according to the map, should have been a simple piece of natural terrain with no tactical significance. She reached it before the others because she'd read the grid quickly and moved without waiting for discussion. What she found was a piece of equipment she didn't expect. A small repeater unit, battery-powered, military-grade, fastened to the underside of a rock ledge with adhesive mounting hardware. It was well concealed, placed low, painted to match the rock face, with no external antenna visible because the antenna was embedded in the unit housing. She photographed it with the evaluation camera she'd been issued. Then she stood up and looked north toward the ridgeline, which from this elevated position was clearly visible. The repeater was pointed at it. Behind her, she heard boots on loose stone, Rourke arriving, then Calloway, then two others in quick succession. She heard them find the equipment, heard the shift in their voices when they understood what they were looking at. Rourke moved up beside her and looked at the ridgeline. 2 nights, she said quietly. He looked at her. You heard it? Yes. You didn't report it. I didn't have enough yet. She kept her eyes on the ridgeline. Now I do. Rourke's hand was already moving to his radio. Not the training frequency, but the emergency channel, the one that bypassed the standard evaluation net and went directly to base security. Wait, she said. He paused. If we call it now, whatever's on that ridgeline goes to ground before anyone can reach it. They'll be monitoring the secondary channels. She looked at him. We need to report it through the evaluation net as a Navy problem result. That buys us 15 minutes before anyone on that ridgeline knows we found the repeater. Rourke held the radio for 2 seconds. His expression was the expression of a man doing rapid risk assessment on a moving problem. Then he keyed the evaluation channel. Base, this is Rourke. Nav element at grid reference November 7-4. We have a hardware find requesting assessment team. Standard language, routine tone, nothing in it to suggest what they actually had. He released the key and looked at her. 15 minutes, he said. She was already looking north again. Somewhere up on that ridgeline, equipment had been running for at least 2 days, feeding transmissions from a position that had no business having anyone in it. And whatever was going to happen next was going to happen very fast. The 15 minutes felt like 4. Rourke kept his voice flat on the evaluation net, the same routine cadence he'd have used reporting a grid coordinate or a terrain feature, and she watched his face while he did it. The deliberate engineering of normalcy in a man who was clearly running a different calculation behind his eyes. He was good at it. Good enough that when the base acknowledged the call with a standard 2-click response, she felt reasonably confident that whoever was monitoring secondary channels from the ridgeline hadn't flagged it. Reasonably confident, not certain. Certainty was a luxury she'd stopped expecting at around age 14. The other candidates had spread around the rock outcropping in the loose, attentive way of people who understood that something had changed but hadn't been told what. Calloway crouched beside the repeater unit and studied it with his hands behind his back, not touching, just looking, the way a man looked at something he recognized but hadn't expected to find here. Decker had moved to higher ground instinctively, maybe 8 meters up the rocky slope, and was scanning north with his evaluation binos. The 2 candidates she knew least, a quiet man named Salas and a taller one named Breck, had positioned themselves facing south and east respectively without anyone telling them to. Whatever else these men were, they were professionals, and professionals read the room. Assessment team ETA is 10 minutes, Rourke said, pocketing his radio. That's not fast enough. He looked at her. Tell me something I don't know. She looked at the repeater, then at the ridgeline. Then she pulled her map from the thigh pocket of her pack and opened it on the flat rock surface beside the unit. The ridgeline sat approximately 2 kilometers to the north, running east-west across the plateau's upper edge. From the repeater's position and orientation, the transmission source was most likely somewhere in the central third of that ridgeline, a section of terrain that, on the map, showed a shallow saddle flanked by 2 higher rocky points. There, she said, putting her finger on the saddle. Rourke leaned over the map. That's outside the evaluation boundary. Yes. Which means if there's somebody up there, they're not part of the exercise. That's what I said 2 nights ago. He straightened and looked at the ridgeline again. The morning sun was fully committed now, throwing hard shadows off every rock face and burning the air above the plateau into the beginning of the shimmer layer that would thicken through the afternoon. At 2 kilometers, the ridgeline was clearly visible, but its details were already starting to dissolve into heat distortion. You think it's active right now? He asked. The unit was warm when I touched the housing. He turned and looked at her. Passive heat, she said. Electronics running generate a temperature differential. The housing was warmer than the rock surface by maybe 4 degrees. In ambient conditions this cool, that means it's been on recently, probably continuously. Rourke stared at her for a long, specific moment. the look of a man rapidly reassessing how much he'd been underestimating a conversation partner. You touched it before you photographed it. I photographed it first, then I touched it. The sequence matters for evidence preservation. You're 18. Yes. She folded the map. And we're wasting time. The assessment team arrived in 11 minutes, not 10, which was the kind of small failure that was meaningless in ordinary circumstances and potentially significant in the ones she suspected they were moving toward. It consisted of 2 facility security personnel in a light utility vehicle and a third individual she hadn't seen before, a compact, dark-haired woman in civilian clothing who moved with the specific economy of someone who spent a lot of time in environments where deliberate movement was a survival skill. She carried no visible equipment. She went directly to the repeater unit without speaking to anyone else. Rourke intercepted one of the security personnel. What's your threat assessment on the northern perimeter? Not my call to make. It should be somebody's call. The security man looked at him with the focused irritation of a person trying to do their job under scrutiny. Sir, I need you to let us work the site. The civilian woman had pulled a small device from her jacket pocket and was running it near the repeater housing without touching it. She looked up once, not at Rourke, not at the security men, but directly at Lena, and held the look for 2 seconds before returning to the device. Lena filed that. Mercer arrived 7 minutes after the assessment team in a second vehicle driving himself. He got out before the vehicle had fully stopped and covered the ground to the rock outcropping with the tight, controlled stride of a man who was very angry and was working very hard not to show it. He looked at the repeater. He looked at Rourke. He looked at Lena. Who found it? Rourke's mouth opened. Her, Calloway said, from where he was still crouched near the unit. He said it simply, without editorial weight, the way you stated a fact. Mercer's gaze moved back to Lena. Walk me through it. She did. Concise, chronological, operationally precise. The 2 nights of radio transmissions, the frequency characteristics, her working hypothesis about source elevation, the navigation problem bringing them to this grid, the find, the decision to report through the evaluation net rather than the emergency channel. When she finished, Mercer was quiet for several seconds. You heard the transmissions and didn't report them, he said. I didn't have enough to report. Incomplete intelligence is worse than no intelligence if it triggers a response that compromises the actual source. That's my call to make, not yours. Yes, it is. She paused. But you weren't available at 2200 last night, and I made a judgment call. I'll defend it. His jaw worked. She could see the competing pressures in his expression. The evaluation commander who needed to maintain authority. The operator who understood that her reasoning was tactically sound, and something underneath both of those, something harder to name, that was doing a more fundamental reassessment. The civilian woman stood up from the repeater and looked at Mercer. It's a 2-way relay, active for approximately 48 hours based on battery depletion rate. Transmission protocols match a surveillance monitoring format. She paused. Someone has been watching this facility. The desert air between all of them felt suddenly denser. From the ridgeline, Lena said. The civilian woman looked at her again. This time she held the look longer. Yes. From the ridgeline. Mercer turned and looked north. His back was to her, and she couldn't see his face, but she could see what happened to his shoulders. The slight drop of a man absorbing a weight he hadn't been carrying a moment ago. He stood like that for 4 seconds. Then he turned back. Evaluation is suspended. All candidates return to the compound. The ridgeline, Lena said. I heard you the first time. No. She kept her voice level. I mean, there's someone up there right now. The unit is active. If we return to the compound before we know who's been watching this facility for 2 days, we're handing them a clean exit. Mercer looked at her with the full intensity of a man who was being argued with in front of his candidates, his assessment team, and a civilian he didn't know and who did not enjoy any of those variables. Stand down, Cross. Sir. Stand down. She closed her mouth. The compound return took 40 minutes. She spent all 40 of them watching the ridgeline from whatever angle her position allowed, and she spent them thinking about the partial alphanumeric string she'd copied into her field notebook 2 nights ago. The compound's operations center was a windowless room in the main building's interior, not the mission room where briefings were held, but a smaller, more functional space behind it, with a communications rack along one wall and a central table covered in flat panel displays. She'd passed its door twice since arriving without going in. Candidates weren't authorized. She was standing at the corridor outside it at 1400, which was 90 minutes after the compound return and 20 minutes after Mercer had gone in with the civilian woman and two of the security personnel and not come back out, when Vasco appeared from the direction of the barracks. He stopped when he saw her. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "Neither are you." He considered this. "What are you doing?" "Waiting." He leaned against the opposite wall and folded his arms. He had the quality she'd noticed from the first day, a watchful stillness that didn't perform itself. He just existed in spaces with a low, observable footprint. "You found the device," he said. "Yes." "And you heard the transmissions before that?" "Yes." 2 nights. He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I didn't know who to trust." The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, and once they were out, she assessed them and found them accurate. She'd held the information not just because the intelligence picture had been incomplete, but because in a facility where her pack had been deliberately overloaded and her room assignment had been designed to disadvantage her, the landscape of trustworthy actors was genuinely unclear. Rourke had come closest to earning it. Vasco had been on the list. He received what she'd said without visible reaction, just absorbed it and nodded slowly. "That's smart." Or paranoid. "In a place like this?" He looked at the operations center door. "Smart." The door opened. Mercer came out first, and behind him the civilian woman, and behind her a man Lena hadn't seen before. Tall, 50 or so, with a federal contractor's look that she'd learned to recognize from the people who occasionally came through Dry Hollow looking for her father. Quiet clothing, practical shoes, eyes that processed a room without appearing to move. He looked at her for half a second and then looked at Mercer. "That her?" he said. Mercer's expression tightened. "That's Cross." The man looked at her again. "You wrote down the partial string." She said nothing. "Can I see your notebook?" She looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at the wall. She took the notebook from her cargo pocket and handed it over. The man opened it to the page, read it again. Then he looked at the civilian woman and turned the notebook toward her. She looked at it and something changed in her face. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes. "Where did you learn to identify embedded protocol strings?" the man asked. "My father." "Who is your father?" "Marcus Cross, former 75th Ranger Regiment. He does private contractor work now." The man processed this. He handed the notebook back to her. "The string is a partial transmission identifier from a surveillance format that was deprecated from standard military use in 2019. He paused. "It's been picked up by 3 other monitoring stations in the last 6 months. Nobody's been able to identify the source." She looked at the notebook, then at him. "Until now." "Until now," he agreed. Mercer was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't apology. It was the expression of a man who had built a model of the world and was finding out that one of his foundational assumptions was wrong, and who was experienced enough to update the model rather than defend it, but who was also honest enough not to pretend the update didn't cost him something. "We have a team moving toward the ridgeline," the man said, "but I want to know what else you observed. Everything. From the beginning." She looked at Mercer one more time. He gave a single, small nod, the kind that didn't announce itself. She started talking. It took 40 minutes to give them everything. Not because there was so much of it, but because the man asked precise follow-up questions that required precise answers, and precision took time. He wanted the exact characteristics of the frequency, the duration patterns, the wind direction at the time of each transmission, which she provided from memory because she had been noting wind conditions every night as a matter of habit. He wanted her to describe the temperature differential of the repeater housing and estimate the power draw implied by it, which she could only do approximately. Throughout it, the civilian woman made notes on a flat tablet without looking up. When it was over, the man sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. "How old are you?" 18? "And you've been here 3 days." "Correct." He looked at Mercer. Mercer said nothing. "All right." The man stood. "Thank you for your time." He said it with the clipped sincerity of someone for whom those words had a specific technical meaning. He left with the civilian woman. Mercer sat across the table from her for a long moment after they were gone. The room was very quiet. The communications rack hummed at a low, steady frequency. "You should have reported the transmissions immediately," he said. "Yes." "You made a unilateral judgment call that wasn't yours to make." "Yes." He let that sit. "And it was the right call." She said nothing. He stood up. "Get some rest. The evaluation resumes at 0600 tomorrow." He walked toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. Without turning around, "Good work, Cross." He left. She sat at the table for a moment and looked at the communications rack, which hummed its single note into the quiet room, indifferent to everything. At 1830, the facility went to an elevated security status that everyone pretended was routine and nobody believed was. The external lighting increased. The patrol frequency doubled. A vehicle she'd never seen before, a dark SUV with federal plates, arrived at the gate and went directly to the operations building. She was in the equipment bay doing maintenance on a rifle when Rourke came in and sat down across the cleaning table from her without being invited. "The Ridgeline team found a hide," he said. "Two-man. Occupied recently. Observation equipment, communications gear, food and water for approximately 6 days." She looked up from the barrel. "They were gone," he said. "Maybe 30 minutes ahead of the team." She thought about that. 30 minutes ahead meant they'd had some kind of alert. The evaluation net call had been appropriately bland, but 30 minutes was fast. If they'd been monitoring closely enough, even a routine call about a navigation find might have tripped something. Did they leave anything? A hard drive. Wiped, apparently, but the tech people think there may be recoverable partitions. He paused. "And this." He placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. She looked at it without touching it. "Go ahead," he said. She unfolded it. Inside was a printed photograph, site, thermal imaging, high quality. The timestamp in the corner showed 2 nights ago, 04:15. The image showed the facility compound from an elevated angle. Several structures were clearly visible. Several individuals were visible as heat signatures in and around the compound. One of them, standing alone at the far end of the barracks, was clearly smaller than all the others. She looked at the photograph for a long time. "They were watching the facility," Rourke said, "but they were watching you specifically." He paused. "Because of your father." The room was very quiet. She set the photograph down, picked up the bore brush, and continued what she'd been doing. "Cross." "I heard you." "That doesn't bother you?" She ran the brush through the chamber. "It bothers me a great deal." She pulled the brush back. "But it doesn't change what I need to do tomorrow." Rourke watched her for a moment. Then he put his elbows on the table and looked at the wall. "Your father know you're here?" "He knows where I am." "Does he know what you found?" She hadn't messaged him since arriving. Contact protocols at this facility required prior authorization for personal communications. She'd requested authorization through the standard intake process, and it had not been either approved or denied in 3 days, which was not standard administrative delay, but a deliberate bureaucratic friction she'd attributed to Mercer's management choices without having proof. "Not yet," she said. Rourke nodded. He stood up and straightened his jacket. "I'll put in a communications authorization request under my credentials. His clearance will still have to verify, but it should move faster." She looked up at him. "Why?" He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. "Because you've been handling things that adults should have handled, and the least I can do is help you make one phone call." He moved toward the door. "Also because if Marcus Cross is who I think he is, he's going to want to know his daughter found something that 3 monitoring stations couldn't." He left. She set down the bore brush and sat with her hands flat on the cleaning table. Marcus Cross. Former 75th Ranger. Current contractor doing work that the people in that operations meeting had recognized immediately when she said his name. She had understood on some level for several years that her father's life had more layers than what was visible from Dry Hollow. The late-night radio work. The occasional visitors who stayed for a day and left without being introduced. The specific things he'd taught her that had nothing to do with hunting or self-reliance and everything to do with the kind of skill set you built when you expected to need it in specific contexts. She had never asked him directly. He had never offered. She picked up the boar brush and finished the cleaning. Quote, At 2100, the communication request cleared. She made the call from the facility's secure communications room, which she had never been inside before, seated in a hard chair at a small table with a handset that had the weight of encrypted government hardware. The call connected in 2 rings. Her father's voice was exactly the way it always was. Low, measured, with the specific unhurried quality of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by things that surprised other people. You're at Black Ridge, he said. Yes. 3 days in. Yes. A pause. What happened? She told him. Briefly, the way he'd taught her. Lead with the operational facts, spare the editorial content, include the sensory data because that's where the truth lived. The transmissions, the repeater, the photograph, the string. When she finished, there was a silence on his end that lasted long enough that she checked the connection quality out of reflex. Dad, I'm here. Another pause. Shorter. The string, read it to me. She opened her notebook and read it. He said nothing for 4 seconds. Who else knows about the string? The man from the operations meeting, the civilian woman, Mercer. Describe the man. She did. Her father made a sound that wasn't quite a word. All right, listen to me. Don't go near the northern perimeter tonight. Stay in the main compound building if you can. Don't talk to anyone else about what you found until I make some calls. Who is he? The man from the meeting. Someone I've been working with. Someone who should have told me you were being sent to that facility. The edge in his voice was quiet but unmistakable. Someone who has some explaining to do. She processed this. You didn't know I was coming here. I knew you'd applied. I didn't know the evaluation had been assigned to Black Ridge. She looked at the wall opposite her. The logic of what she was hearing assembled itself in her head with the same quiet efficiency she applied to tactical problems. Someone placed me here specifically. Yes. Because of you. Most likely. And the people on that ridgeline were already positioned before I arrived. A pause. That's what I'm trying to determine. She looked at the photograph she'd brought with her. The thermal image, her heat signature small and alone at the end of the barracks in the cold of a night 2 days ago. She'd been watched from the moment she stepped off the transport van. Possibly before. Am I a target? She asked. I don't know yet. That's not a comfortable answer. No, he said. It isn't. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard in a long time. Not quite fear, but the thing that lived in the same neighborhood as fear in a man who had spent years being unafraid of most things. Stay visible. Don't isolate yourself. And Lena, I know. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say trust your instincts. A pause, then, in a different tone, quieter, more direct. I was going to say I'm proud of you. Another pause. The other thing too, but that first. She held the handset and looked at the wall. Make your calls, she said. I'll stay put. I'll be in contact by morning. The line went quiet. She sat for a moment with the handset in her hand, feeling the weight of it, before she set it down. The operations center outside the communications room was busy, in the low-key way that facilities got busy when a security situation was being managed. Not frantic, just purposeful, more movement than usual, voices pitched at the functional middle register between calm and urgent. She came out of the communications room and nearly walked into Mercer, who was coming the other direction with a folder and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the flat authority of the evaluation commander, something more complicated. He stopped, looked at her. Your father, he said. Marcus Cross. Yes. I didn't connect it when I read your file. He said it the way a person said something they were choosing to be honest about, even though it cost them something. I should have. She waited. The people on that ridgeline. He paused. We think we know the organization. It's not random surveillance. It's targeted, and it's connected to work your father has been doing for the last 18 months. He looked at her with an expression that was doing something difficult. You were placed here as part of an operation I wasn't briefed on. The evaluation was real, Your scores are real, none of that was manufactured. But your assignment to this facility was not random. She absorbed this. You're not just a candidate, he said. The hallway was quiet around them. Somewhere in the operations center, a radio cycled through a frequency check. The fluorescent light above them hummed. Then what am I? She said. Mercer held her gaze. And in his eyes, beneath the complicated architecture of a man revising everything he'd built in 3 days, was the specific look that she would carry with her long after this facility and this desert and these 16 operators had become part of her past. The look of someone who had been wrong and knew it and was trying to figure out how to be right going forward. Right now, he said, you're the only person in this building who knew what they were looking for before anyone told them to look. He walked past her toward the operations center. She stood in the hallway and let the building move around her. The footsteps, the radio traffic, the low purposeful noise of a facility that had shifted from evaluation mode into something else entirely. Outside, the desert pressed against every wall, and somewhere in the dark, people who had been watching her for 3 days were moving. She didn't sleep. Not because the facility was loud. After 2,300, it settled into the compressed quiet of a building running on reduced personnel, half its normal footprint, the kind of silence that had texture to it. Not because she was afraid exactly, but because her mind had entered the state it went to when a situation had too many moving parts and not enough confirmed data, and in that state, sleep was simply not available as an option. She lay on her rack with her boots on and her field notebook open on her chest and looked at the ceiling and ran the architecture of what she knew against the architecture of what she didn't, looking for load-bearing gaps. What she knew, she had been assigned to Black Ridge through a process that was not random. Someone with access to evaluation assignment protocols had placed her here specifically. The surveillance operation on the northern ridgeline had been running for at least 2 days before the hide was found, which meant it had been established before or immediately upon her arrival, which meant whoever set it up had known she was coming before she got there. Her father was connected to the work that made her a point of interest. The man from the operations meeting, whose name she still didn't have, knew the partial string she'd recorded, recognized it, and had a reaction to it that suggested it was significant in ways she hadn't been briefed on. What she didn't know, who the organization on the ridgeline was, what they wanted, whether they were still in the area or had extracted completely, whether her father's calls through the night had produced anything actionable, and the question she kept returning to, what the evaluation itself actually was, now that Mercer had told her it was real, but its context wasn't. At 0245, she got up, made sure her rifle was in its case and the case was secured, and walked to the operations center. The overnight watch personnel looked up when she came in. A young specialist at the communications rack. A senior NCO she recognized from the gate, heavy set, reading something on a tablet. The NCO set the tablet down. Candidates aren't authorized in this space. I know, I need to speak to Commander Mercer. Commander Mercer is not available. Then I'll wait. The NCO looked at her with the patient exasperation of a man who had drawn night watch and didn't want complications. There's a waiting area outside the briefing room. I'd rather wait here. That's not an option. She looked at the communications rack. The specialist at it was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had heard about her. The way news moved in a small facility, the way her name had been circulating since the range evaluation, and faster since the ridgeline find. The specialist was maybe 22, 23. He had the look of a person trying to decide whether to pretend he wasn't paying attention. Fine, she said. She walked back out into the corridor. She sat on the bench outside the briefing room door and opened her field notebook and went through everything again from the beginning, looking for something she'd missed. At 0320, the operations center door opened and Mercer came out. He looked at her on the bench without visible surprise. He sat down at the other end of it, which was close enough for a conversation and far enough to not be forced into one. You should be asleep, he said. You should too. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen his face come to it. What do you need, Cross? The man from the operations meeting. I need his name and what he told you. Mercer looked at the wall opposite. The corridor was dim. Half the overhead lights had been dimmed for overnight protocols, and the shadows in here were substantial. His name is Gareth Solano. He's a coordinating officer with an interagency task group that I can't name to you. He's been working a surveillance network that your father has been feeding intelligence to for the last 2 years. She waited. The string you recorded is a relay identifier from that network. Specifically, it's an identifier that was only issued to a small number of source contacts. He paused. Your father was one of them. She let the silence sit for a moment. Someone in the network has been compromised. That's Solano's assessment, yes. And the Ridgeline team was trying to establish whether the compromise could be traced back to my father. Mercer was quiet. By watching me, she said, because I'm easier to observe than he is. You're also a test. He said it with the flat directness of a man who had decided honesty was the only currency that worked here. If they could assess your capabilities through the evaluation, your real capabilities, not what's in a file, they could build a more complete picture of what he's passed on to you, what you might know without knowing you know it. She looked at the floor. The linoleum was old, the pattern worn smooth in the center where decades of boot traffic had moved. Solano used the evaluation as a collection platform. Without telling me, Mercer said, and the edge in it was precise and controlled. I was running a legitimate evaluation. I wasn't running an intelligence operation on one of my own candidates. But you knew something was off. He didn't answer immediately. I knew your assignment was unusual. I didn't know why. She looked at him. That's why you push so hard. He met her eyes. I push hard because that's what this evaluation requires. But yes, something about the assignment didn't sit right with me from the start. And when I don't understand why something is happening, I default to pressure. It's not a character virtue. The honesty of that landed differently than she expected. Not like an apology, she didn't need one, but like a man handing over something real instead of something polished. What happens now, she said. Solano is running a full assessment of the Ridgeline find. The hard drive from the hide is being processed at an off-site lab. Your father is in contact with Solano's group directly. He paused. And the evaluation continues. She looked at him. Your scores are yours, he said. The circumstances around your assignment don't change what you did on this range or in this compound over the last 3 days. That stands on its own. She nodded once, slowly. Who else knows about the Solano connection? Rourke. He figured most of it out on his own. I just confirmed it. Nobody else in the candidate group. He paused. And I'd prefer it stayed that way until Solano clears the communication. Understood. He stood up, looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that wasn't quite paternal and wasn't quite collegial, but was somewhere in the terrain between them. Get some sleep, Cross. Even a few hours. One more question. He waited. The photograph. The thermal image from the hide. They were specifically tracking me from the moment I arrived. Yes. Which means someone told them exactly when I was arriving and what I looked like. Mercer's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened by a fraction. Yes. Someone inside this facility. He said nothing. She looked at him. You already know that. I have a suspicion. He said it very carefully. Which is not the same thing as knowledge, and which I am not going to share with you until it is. She nodded. He walked back into the operations center. She sat on the bench for another 10 minutes, doing the math in her head. 16 candidates. The security personnel she'd interacted with. The gate guard who had taken a long time with her paperwork on arrival. The specialist at the comms rack who watched her with a specific flavor of attention. She thought about the anonymous note slid under her door the first night. They're adding weight to your pack again tomorrow. Good luck. Whoever had sent it knew about the pack manipulation. That was inside information. But the tone of it, good luck, didn't read like a hostile actor managing an asset. It read like someone who was conflicted, someone who was inside something they hadn't fully signed up for, trying to give a small counterweight without exposing themselves. She filed this and went back to her room and lay down and was asleep in 6 minutes, which was 2 minutes longer than usual. At 0600, the evaluation resumed. Mercer ran it with the same structure as before. Formation, briefing, assignment to the day's evaluation block, and nothing in his manner indicated that the previous night had been anything other than a routine security matter, now resolved. Most of the candidates appeared to accept this, or at least to perform acceptance, which was close enough for the morning's purposes. The day's evaluation was the one she'd been told about at intake and had been thinking about since, the tactical decision-making exercise. also known in the informal vocabulary of this facility as the compound, a decommissioned industrial structure 2 miles east of the main base, a single-story block of interconnected rooms and corridors that the facility used for scenario-based assessment. Candidates moved through it in pairs or small groups, encountering evolving scenarios designed to test judgment under pressure, information overload, and conflicting command inputs. The design of the exercise was specifically intended to produce failure. That wasn't a flaw. It was the point. You learned more about how a person's decision-making held up under impossible conditions from watching them fail gracefully than from watching them succeed at something manageable. She was paired with Rourke. She wasn't certain whether this was Mercer's decision or Solano's, but after last night, the boundary between those two decision-making authorities had become productively unclear, but she found she didn't mind it. Rourke was the right partner for this kind of work. He thought fast, communicated efficiently, and had the quality she valued most in close tactical environments. He was willing to say when he didn't know something. They rode to the compound in the back of a transport vehicle with Calloway and Decker in the seats across from them. The morning was cooler than previous days, overcast in the way the high desert occasionally got. Not the dramatic storm front overcast of humid climates, but a thin, high cloud layer that softened the light and dropped the ambient temperature by 12 degrees. It made the desert look different, quieter almost. Calloway was going over something in his head. She could see it in the way his eyes were tracking nothing in particular, the internal rehearsal pattern. Decker was looking at his hands. Rourke was watching the terrain out the back of the vehicle. "Rourke," she said quietly. He looked at her. "The note under my door. First night." His expression was flat and informative in its flatness. He knew exactly what she was referring to and was deciding how to respond. "It wasn't you," she said. "No. But you know who it was." A pause. "I have a guess." "Same guess I have?" He looked at her for a moment. "Probably." She nodded and let it go. The compound smelled like old concrete and hydraulic fluid and the faint chemical residue of training munitions. The entry point was a steel door in the east face of the building, which opened into a long, low-lit corridor with rooms branching off it at irregular intervals. The evaluators, 2 of them, both silent, both carrying tablets for scoring, positioned themselves at the entry point and the far exit and let the pairs work independently through the structure. The scenario parameters for each pair were delivered via earpiece immediately before entry. Hers and Rourke's. A 3-person civilian team had been reported inside the structure. 1 confirmed hostile actor, 2 unknowns. Their objectives were to locate the civilian team, assess and neutralize the threat, and extract without civilian casualties. Time limit, 18 minutes. Standard enough. The complexity was in the execution, which was always where the complexity lived. They entered. The first corridor was clear. She moved right, Rourke covered left, their footwork automatically complementary in the way it had become after the shoot-house work. No discussion required, just 2 people who had figured out each other's mechanical habits well enough to fill gaps without being asked. She checked the first doorway. Empty room, overturned furniture, a jacket on the floor that might mean recent occupation or was placed there to invite that inference. She noted both possibilities and moved on. Second room, they found the first civilian. A role player, seated against the far wall, who delivered a scripted assessment when they made contact. Scared, but functional. Male, 20s, no injuries. Reported that he'd come in with 2 others and had been separated when something happened in the rear section of the building. He didn't know what. "How long ago?" Rourke asked. "Maybe 10 minutes. I don't know. It felt long." "Which direction?" He pointed north, toward the deeper section of the building. She looked at Rourke. He nodded. She took point. The third corridor opened into a larger central room that the facility used as the scenario's primary complexity zone. It was larger than the surrounding rooms, with a second level accessible by a steel staircase on the west wall and multiple entry and exit points. It was also where the scenario tended to branch in ways that required real-time decision-making under pressure. She heard the noise before they reached the doorway. A voice, raised, male, giving instructions to someone who wasn't complying. She held up a fist. Rourke stopped. She leaned to the doorway edge and read the room in fragments. A man standing near the staircase base, his back partly to her, speaking at someone she couldn't see. A second figure to the right, role player, civilian, hands up, not injured. The staircase above empty as far as she could tell. The doorway on the far left, which led to the building's northern section, was closed. It shouldn't have been closed according to the layout map she'd memorized. She pulled back and looked at Rourke, held up 2 fingers, 2 subjects visible, then pointed to the closed door and shrugged. He put his mouth near her ear. Third civilian, or the scenario's adding a variable? She thought for 2 seconds. The closed door bothered her more than the active subject near the staircase. An active hostile actor gave you something to track. A closed door in a room that should have an open door was a gap in your information picture, and gaps were where you got hurt. She gestured. She'd take the active subject. He covered the door. They went in. The active subject, the confirmed hostile in the scenario framing, responded to their entry by attempting to move behind the civilian with hands up. She'd anticipated this. Her approach angle had been calculated to deny him the direct line to the second civilian's position, and when he moved, he found she was already positioned to cut him off. He stopped, looked at her, made the scenario decision to comply, which the evaluator's scoring tablets registered as a successful threat neutralization. "Clear," she said. Rourke was at the closed door. He looked at her once. She nodded. He opened it. The room beyond was not empty. A second hostile actor, unannounced in the scenario briefing, a variable injected mid-exercise, stood inside the doorway with a training weapon raised. Rourke had his weapon up, and they were in each other's face for half a second that stretched in the way those moments always did. The scenario protocols required a shoot/no-shoot assessment. The second actor was wearing a red band, hostile identifier. Rourke fired. The evaluator's tablet registered it. But behind the second actor, visible now that the door was fully open, was the third civilian, the one the first role player had reported being separated from, seated on the floor in the back corner of the small room, physically fine, watching all of this with the specific wide-eyed calm of someone who is trying very hard to stay still and out of the way. She moved past Rourke into the room, assessed the third civilian, confirmed no injury. "You're okay, we're moving you out." The civilian looked at her. He was young. The role players at this facility tended to be contractor staff in their 20s, and the adrenaline from the scenario had produced a genuinely unsimulated shakiness in him that she noticed and registered. "There's another one," he said. "Upstairs. I heard them." She looked at Rourke. "Time?" he said. 11 minutes left." He looked at the staircase through the open door, visible from this angle, then at her. Unannounced variables are multiplying. Yes. Scenario or something else? It was the right question. In a standard evaluation exercise, mid-scenario additions were planned and disclosed to the evaluators before entry. An unanticipated hostile in a room that was marked open on the layout map could be deliberate complexity injection by the exercise designers. Or it could be something else entirely. The kind of something else that had been accumulating in this facility's atmosphere for 3 days. She thought about the 17-minute window between when she and Rourke had received their scenario brief and when they'd entered the building. She thought about who had access to the scenario parameters. She thought about Mercer's careful phrasing last night. "I have a suspicion which is not the same thing as knowledge." "We treat it as scenario," she said, "and we move like it isn't." Rourke absorbed this, nodded. They moved the third civilian to the secured room with the first one and left them with the scored-out hostile, who was now cooperating per scenario protocol, and went to the staircase. The upper level was a single open space with low light coming from grated ceiling panels. No furniture. 3 load-bearing pillars arranged in a rough triangle. On the far wall, a window with the glass removed, looking out over the back of the structure toward the desert. A figure stood at this window with their back to them. She assessed immediately. Civilian banding, hands empty, not moving. Role player waiting to deliver information. She moved toward the figure. Rourke held the staircase at her back. The figure turned when she was 4 steps away. Female, 40s, with the civilian contractor look she'd seen on the woman from the operations meeting, though this was a different woman. She held out an envelope. "Scenario addendum," the woman said. "For your eyes only." Lena took it, opened it. Inside was a single card. On it, in typed text, The evaluation has been suspended by authority of Coordinating Officer Solano. Return to vehicle. Do not communicate the content of this instruction to your partner or to evaluators. Come alone. She read it twice. Then she looked at the woman, who was watching her with the neutral expression of a person delivering a message they hadn't written and didn't intend to comment on. She looked down at the card again, felt the weight of it. Not the paper weight, but the decision weight. Solano had suspended the evaluation through a scenario addendum, which was a highly unusual delivery mechanism that bypassed Mercer entirely. The instruction to not tell Rourke was the most operationally significant element, because Rourke would want to know and would be right to want to know, and withholding it from him created a gap in the team's situational picture that was exactly the kind of gap she'd spent 3 days training to avoid creating. She put the card in her pocket. "Rourke," she called toward the staircase. "Scenario's wrapping. Take the civilians to the exit point." A pause. "What's up there?" "Nothing actionable. I'll be down in 2 minutes." Another pause. Longer. She could feel him calculating at the bottom of the staircase. He was good enough to know something was off. He was also disciplined enough to accept a reasonable instruction from a partner he'd come to trust. 2 minutes, he said. She heard his footsteps moving toward the secured room. She looked at the woman. "Solano, where?" "Vehicle, east side of the structure." Solano was seated in the back of a dark SUV with the door open and a laptop on the seat beside him. He looked up when she reached him. His expression was the expression of a man who had been awake all night and had stopped pretending he hadn't. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her for a moment. "Fair enough." He turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a document. Header redacted, content partially visible. She scanned it in the time he allowed before he turned it back. "The hard drive from the hide," he said. The lab pulled a recoverable partition. It had communication logs, timestamps, partial message content, geotagged metadata. He paused. "The logs include references to this facility, to the evaluation schedule, and to you by name. They also include a name I need you to tell me if you recognize." He said a name. She kept her face still. Her heartbeat didn't change, because she'd trained herself over years not to let her face say what her body was doing. But her body was doing something. "Where did you get that name?" she said. "From the log." "Do you recognize it?" "Yes." "From where?" She looked at him directly. "From my father. He mentioned that name once, approximately 14 months ago, in a context that I understood to mean a professional association. I didn't ask for details. Do you know what that name is associated with now? Based on what you've shown me and what I've pieced together? An actor inside a network who has been selectively feeding information about network contacts to an external surveillance organization. A compromise." She paused. "Someone who knew my father's identifier string." Solano looked at her for a long moment. "You're 18 years old. You keep saying that like it explains something." "It does." He closed the laptop. "It explains why I'm sitting here having this conversation with you instead of with someone who has 20 years of field work, because someone who has 20 years of field work spent 3 days in that evaluation and didn't find what you found." She said nothing. "I need to know everything your father told you about the person whose name I just said. Every detail you can remember. Context, timing, anything else that was said around it." He looked at her. "And I need you to understand that what you tell me could be used in a proceeding that implicates a federal contractor. So I need you to be precise." She looked at the desert over his shoulder, dry and enormous and indifferent to all of this. "I need to talk to my father first," she said. "I know. He's on a secure line waiting for your call." He held out a handset. "I had it patched through 20 minutes ago. I was waiting for you to tell me you'd talk." She took the handset. Her father answered before the first ring completed. His voice was different than it had been last night, more compressed, the way it got when he was managing something active. "You saw the name," he said. "Yes." "I need you to tell them what I told you. All of it." She was quiet for a second. "Are you sure?" "Yes." A pause. "I should have told you more a long time ago. I was trying to protect you from it." "I know." That wasn't the right call. His voice dropped a register. "I'm sorry for that." She handed the handset back to Solano. Tell me what to do, she said. Solano took the handset, looked at her. Start at the beginning. So she did. The debrief with Solano lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, which meant she was still in the SUV on the east side of the compound when the rest of the candidates completed their evaluation exercises and were transported back to the main facility. Rourke would know by then that she hadn't returned on the 2-minute timeline she'd given him. He would have told Mercer. Mercer would have, she hoped, understood why without being told. When it was over, Solano sat back and looked at the desert for a long moment. The name on the log, he said. The asset that was compromised. We've been looking for the leak for 8 months. She waited. Your father's been helping us run it down. He gave us a shortened list 3 months ago. The name was on it. He paused. But it was on it with 4 other names, and we couldn't narrow it further without evidence we didn't have. Until the ridgeline. Until the ridgeline. He looked at her. Which you found. Which you identified as significant before anyone with authority in this facility was even looking for it. She looked at her hands. They were steady. They always were, in the aftermath of things. The steadiness came back fast, the same way it always had, like a gyroscope returning to center. What happens to the name? Federal process. It'll take time. These things always do. He paused. But yes, there will be a process. She nodded. Solano closed the laptop. He looked at her with the assessing quality that had been in his eyes since she'd first seen him in the operations center, except now it had something additional in it. Not warmth exactly, but the specific regard of a person who had revised their estimate of something significantly. Your father raised you to do this. He raised me to think. Same thing in his work. She didn't argue with that. He opened the SUV door. I'll have someone take you back. Mercer's expecting you. He's going to want a debrief of his own. What do I tell him? Solano stepped out, straightened his jacket, looked back at her. Tell him everything. He paused. He already knows most of it. He deserves the rest. Mercer's debrief was different from Solano's. Shorter, more direct. He sat across the mission room table from her with his clipboard closed in front of him, unused for the first time she could remember seeing it, and let her go through it without interruption until she was done. Then he said, The note under your door. First night. Yes. Solace, he said. She'd suspected Solace, the quiet man, the one who'd positioned himself facing south and east during the ridgeline find without being told. The instinctive, experienced positioning of someone who understood threat geometry, but also the one who'd barely spoken to her, not from hostility, but from the specific discomfort of a person carrying something they hadn't decided how to put down. He was inside the operation, wasn't he? She said. Mercer's expression was careful. He was an observer, brought in under cover of evaluation candidacy. His actual role was to monitor your activities and report to Solano's group. He paused. He wasn't supposed to interfere. The note was him making a decision he wasn't authorized to make. Because he thought it was wrong. Yes. Mercer looked at the table. Because he thought what was being done to you was wrong. And he's the kind of man who can't quite stomach that kind of thing, even when he's been told the operational necessity outweighs the cost. He paused. I understand the feeling. The room was quiet. She looked at the closed clipboard, at the table surface, at the particular quality of afternoon light coming through the single high window of the mission room. Lower now, more amber, the desert light that meant the day was beginning to think about ending. Mercer. He looked at her. You doubled my workload. You loaded my pack. You put me in the coldest room. Yes. That wasn't just pressure testing. He held her gaze. It started as pressure testing. It became something else when I started understanding that my instinct about your assignment was right. He paused. I was trying to get you to leave. She absorbed this. Because you thought it was safer for me if I washed out. Yes? Without knowing why. Without knowing why. He looked at the table, which is the thing I'm least comfortable with in retrospect, acting on an instinct I couldn't justify. She thought about this. About a man who had spent his career making high-stakes decisions with incomplete information, who had applied that same framework to an 18-year-old girl and arrived at the wrong conclusion for reasons that were, in their own logic, not entirely unreasonable. It's a strange thing, she said, to be protected by the same person who's making your life difficult. Yes, he said, it is. He opened the clipboard, not to write anything, just to have something to do with his hands. For what it's worth, your scores are the highest in this evaluation group, across all categories. The weighting decisions I made and how the board was posted I'm adjusting those. She looked at him. The board will be reposted tonight, he said, with accurate numbers. It wasn't an enormous gesture, but it was a precise one, the specific restitution that mattered, applied to the specific thing that had been taken. She recognized the care in it. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Evaluation concludes tomorrow. Full group debrief at 0800, then individual sessions through the afternoon. He stood up. Get some rest. Real rest this time. She stood as well, moved toward the door. Cross. She stopped. Your father. He was looking at the window. He's a difficult man to work with, from what I know of him. Yes. He taught you well. She looked at him. He did his best, she said, which was the truest thing she could say about it, and also the most complicated. Mercer nodded slowly, like a man recognizing a weight he understood. She walked out into the corridor. The facility around her moved in its late afternoon rhythm. The smell of food from the mess, boots on linoleum, a radio cycling in a back room. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place that had been running a complicated operation for 3 days and was now, carefully, beginning to put that operation to rest. She walked back toward her room at the far end of the barracks. Outside, through the building's single narrow window at the end of the corridor, the desert turned the color of old copper in the setting sun. Somewhere on a bench in the common area, she passed Salas, who looked up when she walked by. He didn't say anything. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said, for the note. He looked at his hands. I wasn't supposed to. I know. She paused. It was still the right call. He was quiet for a moment. When he looked up, his expression was the expression of a man who had been carrying something and had been given permission, finally, to set it down. You were always going to find it, he said. I just wanted you to have a fair shot while you did. She nodded once. She walked the rest of the way to her room and sat on her rack in the amber light of the desert evening, and for the first time since arriving at Black Ridge, the silence around her felt like something other than a test. She slept for 6 hours without interruption, which was the longest unbroken sleep she'd had since arriving at Black Ridge, and when she woke the room was still dark, and the desert outside was making the low, pressureless sound it made in the hours before dawn. Not silence exactly, but the closest thing to it that existed in a place where wind moved constantly across open ground. She lay still for a moment and took inventory the way she did every morning: body, mind, situation. Her shoulders still ached from the overloaded pack days, a deep muscular complaint that would take a week to fully resolve. Her hands were fine. Her head was clear in the specific way it got after genuine sleep. Not the fragile clarity of insufficient rest, but the solid, load-bearing kind. The situation was what it was. The evaluation's final day, a group debrief at 0800, individual sessions in the afternoon, and somewhere underneath all of that, the slow-moving machinery of what Solano had set in motion the previous afternoon, grinding toward consequences that would take months to fully manifest. She got up, dressed, laced her boots, and went outside before anyone else was moving. The final morning formation happened at 0730, 30 minutes before the group debrief. Mercer ran it the way he ran every formation, efficiently, without ceremony, going down the line with the clipboard that was back in his hand where it belonged. When he reached her position, he paused for the standard beat, made his notation, and moved on. No different from how he'd treated anyone else. She recognized that as a deliberate choice on his part, and found she respected it. After formation, before they moved to the briefing room, Calloway fell into step beside her. He was quiet for half the walk. Calloway was a man who approached conversation the way he approached a precision shot. He waited until he had something worth saying before he said it. Heard the board's being reposted, he said. Yes? Scores look different. I imagine they do. He was quiet for another few steps. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't part of it. The first day. He said it without self-flagellation. Just flat acknowledgement, the way you acknowledged a technical error. I laughed. She looked at him sideways. "I'm telling you because it bothers me that I did," he said. "Not because I need you to tell me it's fine." She thought about that. "It doesn't need to be fine," she said. "It just needs to not happen again." He nodded once. "Fair." They walked the rest of the way without speaking, and it was a comfortable silence, which was different from the silences of the previous 3 days in a way she couldn't have described precisely, but felt clearly. The group debrief was held in the main briefing room with all 16 candidates present, minus Salas, who had been quietly withdrawn from the candidate roster overnight through a process nobody commented on publicly. His seat at the table simply empty in the way that things disappeared in operational environments when the people managing those environments decided they needed to. She noted the empty seat. Nobody else appeared to mention it. Mercer stood at the front of the room with the dry erase board behind him and ran the debrief the way he ran everything. Direct, structured, no wasted motion. He went through the evaluation metrics category by category. He presented the corrected scores without explaining why they'd been corrected, which was a choice that said everything necessary. The numbers had been wrong, they were now right, and the reason for the discrepancy was not a subject for this room. When he reached the precision rifle evaluation section and posted the final corrected leaderboard, the room went quiet in the specific way rooms went quiet when something definitive was put in front of people. Her name sat at the top of that category, not narrowly, by a margin that was, in the context of this evaluation group, significant. Nobody laughed. Calloway made a small sound that might have been satisfaction. Rourke looked at the board with the expression of a man confirming something he'd known since the range. Decker sat back in his chair and crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling briefly, not from frustration, but from the body language of a person recalibrating. Mercer moved on through the remaining categories without pausing on the leaderboard. The overall evaluation standings, when he posted them, had her second, behind Calloway by a margin of 4 composite points, which was real and not manufactured. Calloway was genuinely exceptional, and his consistency across all physical and technical categories over the full evaluation period had been better than hers on aggregate. She'd had a stronger ceiling on the precision shooting. He'd had a more consistent floor across everything else. Second was accurate. She was comfortable with accurate. After Mercer finished the metrics review, he put down the marker and looked at the room. "Before we move to individual sessions this afternoon," he said, "I want to address something that's not in the metrics." The room shifted. During this evaluation, we had a security event. He said it with the same measured tone he used for everything, but the room's attention focused differently at those words. Sharper, more personal. "You're aware of the broad facts. A surveillance installation was identified on the northern perimeter. The source was located, and the situation is being managed through appropriate channels." He paused. "What you may not fully be aware of is that the identification of that installation was initiated not by facility security personnel, not by the assessment team, and not by me. Nobody moved. It was initiated by candidate Cross, who identified anomalous radio traffic on 2 consecutive nights, correctly assessed its operational significance, made a series of judgment calls about when and how to report it that I would characterize as tactically sound, and ultimately located the physical source during the navigation exercise." He held the room for a moment. She did this without being asked to, without being given the tools or authority to do it, and in the face of an evaluation environment that was, for reasons I take responsibility for, more hostile to her than it should have been. The silence in the room was the kind that had weight. "I want to be direct about that last part," he said. "My conduct toward candidate Cross in the early days of this evaluation was not up to the standard this facility is supposed to maintain. I made assumptions based on factors that had nothing to do with performance, and I allowed those assumptions to shape an evaluation environment that was inequitable." He looked at her directly. "I'm saying that in front of this group because the people in this room were part of that environment, and because the standard we hold each other to requires naming things clearly." The room was very still. She kept her face level. It was an extraordinary thing to watch. A man with 2 decades of institutional authority in a room full of people who deferred to him by habit, choosing to diminish himself publicly without any external pressure requiring him to do it. She understood what it cost him. She also understood why he'd done it this way rather than in private. And the why was the more important part. He'd done it this way because the men in this room had participated, and they needed to hear the accounting from the same person who had set the tone. After the briefing, there was a long 20 minutes where the room moved from debrief mode to the informal space before individual sessions began. Coffee, movement, the low-register conversation of people processing what they'd just heard. She was standing at the edge of the room with a cup of water when Decker appeared at her shoulder. "He didn't have to do that," Decker said. "No. That took something." "Yes." Decker looked at his coffee. "I loaded your pack, second day. Mercer asked for a volunteer and I did it." He said it the way Calloway had said his piece, without dramatizing it, without excessive self-criticism, just as a fact being named. "I want you to know I know that." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just think you should know who did it." She thought about this, about the specific honesty it required and the specific discomfort it was coming from. "Why did you volunteer?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted to see if you'd quit." He paused. "And because I thought watching you quit would feel like confirmation of something I already believed." He looked at his coffee again. "It didn't work out that way." "No," she said. "It didn't." He nodded slowly. Then, without anything else attached to it, he walked to the other side of the room, and they didn't speak again that morning, and she found that was the right amount, that sometimes naming a thing was sufficient, and that asking for more than that was its own kind of greed. Her individual session with Mercer was scheduled for 1400. In the hours before it, she went to the range alone, cleared through the range officer, who didn't comment, and ran 50 rounds through the precision rifle at distances between 400 and 800 meters. Not an evaluation, just shooting, the way she'd always shot when she needed to think, the repetition of the process creating a kind of moving stillness, each shot requiring enough presence to push everything else to the edges without requiring enough cognition to prevent the edges from working on their own. She was thinking about her father. Solano had told her the previous afternoon at the end of their session that the process initiated by the Ridgeline find would be a long one. Federal proceedings moved at their own pace. The name on the compromised asset list would be referred to a joint task group, which would initiate a formal investigation, which would run through a process that was measured in months, not weeks. There would be consequences, real, documented, binding, but they would arrive slowly, the way justice and institutional systems always did. Not as a dramatic reversal, but as a gradual accumulation of accountable moments. Her father's role in that process would involve disclosure, material he'd been sitting on for 2 years, source contact information, communication logs that he had maintained with the careful precision of a man who had understood that the work he was doing might eventually require exactly this kind of accounting. He would be asked to testify before the task group. He had already agreed to do so. She had understood, somewhere in the previous 24 hours, something about him that she hadn't fully understood before. Not that he had been hiding things from her. She'd known that in an abstract way for years. But why he'd hidden them? He had been carrying the weight of a situation he couldn't resolve. In work, he couldn't fully explain. With consequences he couldn't control, and he had tried to keep that weight from landing on her by keeping the information from her, which was a decision made from love and was also, as he had admitted in their phone call, the wrong call. He had protected her by underestimating her. She put the next round downrange and watched the steel ring at 700 meters. The difference between her father and Mercer, she thought, was that her father had done it from love and Mercer had done it from assumption. The result had been the same, someone deciding, without sufficient evidence, that she couldn't handle what was in front of her. She fired the next round. The difference between both of them and the men on the ridgeline was intent. The surveillance operation had not been protective. It had been extractive, her life, her capabilities, her knowledge, treated as a resource to be assessed and potentially exploited. That was the category that didn't get complicated by love or assumption. That was just wrong. She fired the last round in the string. The steel rang. She stayed behind the optic for a moment, then lifted her head and looked downrange at the desert stretching beyond the range's terminal berm, flat and open, and extending to a horizon that seemed farther away than it ever had in other light. She wasn't angry. That surprised her, a little. She'd expected to find anger when she got quiet enough to look for it. Anger at Mercer for the pack, at Decker for volunteering, at the broader machinery of assumptions that had arranged itself around her from the moment she'd stepped off the transport van. She found something more complicated than anger. She found the specific, tired clarity of someone who had moved through a thing and come out the other side with a more accurate map of the territory. The territory included her father's limitations, Mercer's limitations, her own, the places where she'd been less precise than she needed to be, the moments where she'd made judgment calls that were defensible but not perfect, the shot she'd missed at 800 meters because she'd misjudged the wind interval by half a second. None of that was comfortable, but it was real. And real, in her experience, was always more useful than comfortable. She packed up the rifle and walked back to the compound. The individual session with Mercer lasted 50 minutes, which was longer than the other candidates' sessions by approximately 20 minutes, a fact she learned afterward from Rourke, and which she suspected was not accidental. They sat across the mission room table from each other, the closed clipboard between them, and Mercer went through a structured review of her evaluation performance that was notably different from what the previous day's interactions had felt like. Not warmer, exactly. Mercer was not a warm man by disposition, and she respected that about him enough not to require him to perform a warmth he didn't have, but direct, honest, the kind of honest that required effort. He went through every evaluation category with specific numerical precision, comparing her performance data to baseline standards and to the evaluation group's aggregate. When he reached categories where her score reflected his interference, the weighted pack runs, the room assignment, he named that explicitly rather than treating the data as if it existed in a vacuum, which she appreciated. When the formal review was done, he put the clipboard aside. "Solano has submitted a recommendation," he said. She waited. "There's a program. It doesn't have a name I'm authorized to give you. What I can tell you is that it's a 12-month development track for candidates with a specific profile, analytical, field-capable, with an aptitude for operational pattern recognition in intelligence-adjacent contexts." He looked at her. "He's recommending you for it." She sat with this for a moment. "What does it involve?" "Advanced fieldwork, technical skill development in areas you've demonstrated aptitude in. Some classroom work, but primarily scenario-based training in environments that are more complex than what you've experienced here." He paused. "It would begin in approximately 6 weeks." "Where?" "I can't tell you that at this stage." She looked at the table. "What did you tell him?" "I told him my evaluation supported the recommendation." He said it flatly, factually. "Your performance in this evaluation, taken in its entirety, is consistent with the profile the program is looking for." She was quiet for a moment. "You're recommending me." "Yes." The word sat between them with a specific weight. 3 days ago? Less than 3 days ago. This man had loaded her pack and given her the worst room in the barracks and expected her to fail. Now he was sitting across a table from her and recommending her for a program that she suspected was more significant than his careful language suggested. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes?" "If I hadn't found the repeater, if the evaluation had just been the evaluation, the runs, the range, the shoot house, the nav problems, would you have recommended me?" He was quiet for long enough that the answer was already visible before he said it. "I don't know," he said. "I think I would have reached the same place eventually, but I don't know how long it would have taken me to get there, given how I started." He met her eyes. "That's an honest answer." "I know," she said. "It's why I asked." He picked up his clipboard, set it back down, the gesture of a man who had run out of things to do with his hands, but needed a moment before the next thing. "The world you're moving into," he said, "is full of people who are going to underestimate you. Not because they're malicious, most of them, just because you don't fit the shape of what they expect. You're going to spend a lot of energy on things that other people don't have to spend energy on." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you that to discourage you," he said. "I'm telling you because you should go in knowing it, so you can decide in advance how you want to carry it." He paused. "I carried it badly, on my end. I'd rather you not have to pay for that twice." It was, she thought, the most human thing she'd heard him say. "I've been carrying it my whole life," she said. "I'm pretty good at it by now." Something moved in his expression that was as close to a smile as his face ever managed. "Yes," he said. "I noticed." He stood, extended his hand. She stood and shook it. His grip was what she'd expected, firm, brief, specific in the way of a man who didn't make unnecessary gestures but made the necessary ones precisely. Good luck, Cross. Thank you, Commander. She walked out of the mission room for the last time. Rourke found her at the water point on the range's northern edge, which had become their location by the logic of habit and geography, for what she understood would be the last time. The desert was doing what it did in the late afternoon of its better days, turning every surface to copper and amber, making the ridgeline to the north look like something that had been there since before people had words for things. The high cloud layer had burned off through the afternoon, and the sky was clear and enormous. Solano's program, Rourke said. How do you know about it? Because he asked me the same question 6 months ago. He looked at the ridgeline. I turned it down. She looked at him. Why? Because I'm 38 years old and I've been doing field work for 15 years and I know what my capabilities are and where they end. He said it without self-deprecation, just as an accurate inventory. The profile they're looking for is someone who can grow into the work over a long period. At my age, you're already what you're going to be. He glanced at her sideways. At 18, you're something else entirely. She thought about this program. The unnamed 12 months, the unnamed location, the work her father had been doing that had pointed, in some indirect but apparently deliberate way, toward this evaluation and this recommendation. She thought about whether she was being moved by her own decision or by a mechanism that had been running longer than she'd been aware of. Do you think my father knew this was going to happen? She said. Rourke was quiet for a long moment. I think your father is a man who prepares for multiple outcomes simultaneously, he said carefully. And I think some of those outcomes align with what happened this week. Whether he knew specifically, he shrugged. That's a conversation to have with him. She nodded. They stood in silence for a while, looking at the ridgeline. The hideout there was empty now. Whatever it had contained either seized or extracted. The two-man surveillance team that had spent days watching this facility, watching her, gone into whatever process awaited them. She didn't know the specifics of what their accountability would look like. Solano had told her it was active and moving, but hadn't provided detail. She found she was less invested in the specifics than she would have expected. What mattered was that the mechanism was real, that the thing she'd found was going to produce something concrete, not just be absorbed into the institutional silence that swallowed so many things. The partial string in her field notebook had become something. The 2 nights of careful listening had become something. That was enough. I'm going to accept the recommendation, she said. Rourke nodded slowly. I know. Did you know before I did? I suspected before you did. He picked up his water bottle. You're not built for the kind of life where you stop and stay stopped. He looked at her. You're built for the next thing, whatever that is. She thought about what she'd told him weeks ago. It felt like weeks, though it had been 4 days, when he'd asked why she'd come to Black Ridge. Because it's the next thing. She'd said she didn't know yet where it led. She still didn't know, with precision. But the picture had more resolution now than it had on the morning she'd stepped off the transport van, with dust on her boots and one duffel, and the desert's lesson about silence already carrying inside her like a piece of equipment she'd been issued long before she needed to use it. Thanks for the even hand, she said. Through all of it, he made a small sound. I wasn't always even. Closer than most. He accepted this with a nod and walked back toward the compound. She stayed at the water point until the sun touched the ridgeline, and the desert went from copper to dark gold to the particular dense purple that preceded full dark in this part of the country. She stayed until the first stars appeared. The transport vehicle left at 700 the following morning. She was at the gate at 6:50 with her duffel packed and her rifle returned to the armory and her field notebook in her cargo pocket. The desert was cold and bright in the way of early mornings here, the kind of clean, sharp light that made everything look like the first version of itself. The other candidates were loading their gear. Some had vehicles picking them up. A few were on the same transport she was. Calloway stopped beside her at the gate and looked at the desert for a moment. Second, he said. Yes. Those are real numbers. He said it as a point of confirmation, not consolation. Yes. Good. He held out his hand. She shook it. We'll be in the same rooms again, he said. It was a prediction, offered without elaboration, with the confidence of a man who had learned to read trajectories. Probably, she said. He moved on. Decker passed her without stopping, but he met her eyes for half a second as he went by. A look that carried something without specifying what, which was its own form of honesty. She was still standing near the gate when Mercer came out of the operations building and crossed the compound toward the vehicle pool. He didn't alter his trajectory toward her, but he passed close enough that stopping was natural. He looked at her for a moment. Then he bent down and picked something off the ground near her foot. A small pebble, flat, unremarkable. He looked at it the way you looked at something you'd picked up reflexively and then decided to keep. Something I've been thinking about, he said. Since last night. She waited. You knew, didn't you, about the pack before you got to the start line the first morning? Yes. You didn't report it. You didn't adjust it. You just carried the extra weight. Yes. He turned the pebble in his fingers. Why? She looked at the gate, at the desert beyond it, at the enormous open space that was waiting on the other side of the barrier. Because complaining about the conditions doesn't change them, she said, and changing them takes time I didn't have. She paused, and because I wanted to see what I could do with the weight exactly as it was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put the pebble in his pocket, a small, private gesture that she suspected he wasn't fully aware of making, and nodded once. Safe travels, Cross. You too, Commander. He walked toward the vehicle pool. She picked up her duffel, turned to face the gate, and waited for it to open. When it did, the desert came in through the gap. The smell of dry heat and distance. The specific weight of open air after days inside a facility's compressed atmosphere. She walked through the gate and onto the road beyond it without looking back. Not because she was hardened to what she was leaving, but because looking back was a thing you did when you weren't sure about the direction you were moving. She was sure. She didn't know everything that was coming. She didn't know the name of the program, or the location, or the specific shape of the work that waited in the 12 months ahead. She didn't know how the federal process would move, or what her father's testimony would ultimately produce, or whether the man whose name was on the compromised asset list would face the full weight of what he'd done or a partial version of it. She didn't know how many more rooms she'd walk into where the laughter started before she'd even set down her bag. She knew this. Every one of those rooms had an ending that the people laughing couldn't yet see. And she had learned, in the desert and in the cold and in the accumulated weight of 4 days at a facility that had tried to tell her who she was before it had bothered to look, she had learned that the ending was hers to write. Not because she was exceptional in ways that made the hard parts easy, but because she had been willing to carry the weight exactly as it was and keep moving and let the truth about herself catch up when it was ready. The transport vehicle was waiting 100 meters down the road. She shouldered her duffel and walked toward it through the early morning light, the desert opening up around her in every direction, vast and still and indifferent in the best possible way. Not hostile, not welcoming, just real. Just there. Just the territory, waiting to be moved through by whoever was willing to learn its language. She had been learning it her whole life. She wasn't finished yet. The people who dismiss you are not seeing the full picture. They're only seeing the frame, what lives inside it, that belongs entirely to you. Carry it well. Move forward anyway. The truth has a way of making itself visible to anyone patient enough to keep showing up.